Hello, everybody, and welcome to the now seemingly once per set How Did Jason Yee Do So Well at the Pro Tour episode of Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, as you can hear, joined by Pro Tour Amsterdam top 8 competitor Jason Yee. Jason, first of all, huge congrats on your current Pro Magic run. You've just been
Thank
insanely
you.
hot. And second of all, how you doing?
I'm doing well. I've been for the past 2 months really in the constructed minds, figuring out how this whole modern format thing works. I still do not enjoy modern at all. Standard, I was actually quite
Mm.
excited for the last PT. Slogurk was a sweet deck, but not Nadu, it's okay, I guess. Kind of busted, but like I don't know. I do not enjoy the modern format. This limited format though was a banger. Very very excited to talk about that.
Yeah, we're definitely going to be focusing mostly on the limited aspect of things, but the Pro Tour being mostly constructed, we're going to touch on that a little bit too. Interesting to hear that you are not that fond of modern. I think that that's a sentiment that a lot of people in the community are sharing currently with Nadu running around. But
Yeah.
for just to spell it out, basically, people that maybe have not caught wind, Jason once again top eighted a Pro Tour. Is this three back to back or two? What's happened? This is your second top eight?
This is okay. So this is my third PT overall. The three pro tours I've played like in my entire life have been the three pro tours this year, unless you count
Right.
Arena Championship one, which I completely bombed.
Okay.
But
We won't count
uh,
that then.
um, this would be my second top eight in the row. I top eighted this one and the previous one, and my first PTA only got top 16.
Ugh, such a scrub. Jeez, yeah, yeah, just a ridiculous run. Yeah. So huge congrats on that. Do you have every just quickly before we actually get into the episode? Do you have anything that you can attribute that to? Because that's just like clearly you're a great player. I've known this for a long time. But is there anything specific you think you're like, you know what? I think that is a quality of myself as a player that has probably helped me get there.
Yeah, so I'd say primarily two things. So first of all, I have a lot of time on my hands because like right now I don't have like a full-time job per se, or at least not
Hmm.
one that's like really, if I were to fill out tax forms, I would say I'm like mostly unemployed, basically, right?
Right.
Like yeah, I'm somewhat living off of like income from writing articles for Magic and winning at Magic tournaments, apparently.
Doing well
So
there. Yeah.
yeah, so I've had a lot of time to put into Magic. So like this past month, I've been really just everything I do is just preparing for the PT. Really, I'll play Magic for like 8 hours a day or something. And it hasn't gotten old yet, so that's nice. But
That's good.
yeah, one thing I would definitely say is like I have a lot of time to put in, which I know not everyone has. That's not something that like everyone can do or is willing to do, maybe in some cases.
Yeah, it's
Um,
not exactly a piece of impartable wisdom, but it is
yeah,
a contributing factor for sure.
the second thing I wanted to point out, though, which is less so like a property of me, and also not, I guess, not really that much of impartable wisdom either, but just like I think a big part of my success has been like just being part of a great team. Like Sanctum is great. I have really enjoyed my time testing with Sanctum. I've really enjoyed like just working with people who like all are there to improve at Magic, to figure out like how to break the constructed format, how to break the limited format, and plenty of great friends there as well. And yeah, I just cannot stress enough how much like working as part of a team has been a huge part of my success, right? Just like having people to bounce ideas off of, not just like trying to rely on myself and on like what other people like say on the internet, right? But like actually having people to have in-depth conversations with, that has been very valuable. I mean, another part of that, which is maybe a bit more applicable, like more widely, is just like honestly a version of this is just like participating in limited discussions like a few years ago, like during the pandemic, quite a bit in your server in the limited level up Discord, right? That's where I really like cut my teeth on limited
Yeah.
like during the pandemic and like call time Strixhaven. And I like that was also like really a formative part of my like journey through getting better at Magic. And just in general, just having other people to talk to is really important in Magic, because Magic is so complex. There's so many moving parts. You can't do everything by yourself, and you
Hmm.
can also can't do everything just by like reading things on the internet where people are less likely to be engaging like in depth and more likely to just giving you the quick hits. And like, yeah, of course, like listening to content creators and such will also helps to some extent, but like really being able to converse in detail one on one with people, very valuable.
And in good faith, I think is important because you're gonna find a lot of people on the internet that are just there. I like maybe not exactly just to troll, but maybe to like they're arguing a point just for the sake of maybe feeling right about something, or people be overly hyperbolic about certain things. Like you can't be like I had somebody in my chat yesterday. Somebody mentioned like, oh, there's not a lot of graveyard interaction. There's not a lot of reasons to exile somebody's graveyard in this format. Maybe you're playing blue black and somebody else was like, actually, you're completely wrong. And it's like, okay, clearly you might disagree, but they're not completely wrong. And this isn't a super graveyard heavy format. Anyways, point stands. I think definitely what you said is true, and good little sneaky interjection for the a plug for the limited level ups Discord. I would also suggest going over there if you want to talk to some people who are very interested in getting better.
Highly recommend.
And if you do want to join that limited level ups Discord, it's free. It's open. You don't have to be a patron to join it. You can find it either just by Googling it, or I always have the link in both the YouTube video description and the description of the podcast feed as well. Go check that out. But if you do want to support the show and want to get some extra benefits from that patron, where you get bonus channels from myself, where you get direct access to deck tech help, draft log review help, all that kind of good stuff, you can check out the Patreon at patreon.com/limited level ups. That is the place that you can go to get a bunch of rewards, including Discord benefits, and support the podcast. If that's something you want to do, if you feel like you've gotten some value from the podcast, you've won a few more drafts, go check it out. Really do appreciate that support. Helps the show keep on going. And let's keep on going with the show, shall we?
3, 2, 1, let's go!
All right, so yeah, what we have on the docket today is we're gonna, of course, talk to Jason about the kind of ins and outs of Modern Horizons 3, what Team Sanctum kind of thought, what Jason thought, because this is a big part of what we like to have Jason on the show for. Just hearing sort of the conversation, almost being a fly on the wall. I think that's always very interesting, and especially because Jason was just telling me before we recorded it that not a lot of in tuneness with the wider limited community with this set. Not that you disagree inherently, but you haven't been as plugged into what everybody has been saying. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I know that people have been screaming from the rooftops about writing Chrysalis, but like
Yes.
other than that, I have no idea.
Which I'm very excited to hear what you and the team have to say, what the independent conclusions you've come to. Then we're going to go over just quickly talking about the two decks that were drafted during the Pro Tour, one on each day, of course, as they tend to happen if you get to day 2, which Jason did, and being an important part of the Pro Tour and qualifying and getting to the top 8 is playing constructed. So we're going to have a little bit of Nadu conversation at the end, breaking down the deck that Jason played. Okay, so Jason, let's start with your preparation, Team Sanctum's preparation. I usually ask you the main question of like, what's the biggest difference that the conclusion that you and Sanctum have come to compared to the general limited population, their conclusions and the thoughts. But we don't really have that because, like you said, you haven't been as plugged into the just the general consensus. But you do have a breadth of knowledge of what you and your team thought about the format. So I'll just leave it to you, just as broadly or as narrow as you want to start. Um, what do you think about Modern Horizons 3, the format? How do you win in said format?
So Modern Horizons 3 has been a banger of a set, in my opinion. I think that this is one of my favorite sets of all time. I think honestly, this is breaking my top 3.
Wow. Okay.
Probably like just behind Strixhaven and Call Time. In my top 3 limited formats of all time. So really been enjoying the set. And what I've been really enjoying about it, and what I think like makes the set tick, is just like this is such a highly synergistic set in my view. Like the set is all about trying to find some really deep, like really strong synergy, and then going really deep on it. Right, whether it be like figuring out how to cast a bunch of big Eldrazi, or like figuring out how to make like energy cards work together to be like bigger than the sum of their parts, or even like building around very like small singular one-off cards, like Chthonian Nightmare, figuring out how to make that card like really maximize that card, or figuring out how to get tons and tons of value out of Essence Reliquary, right? There's just like not only is the main set architecture of like, there's this there's Eldrazi and Teamer and Energy and Jeskai and Modified and Abzan, and then like two other, like there's the blue black draw 3 and the black red artifacts deck. Like all of those are heavily synergy based. But then there's also just these random like one-off things, like I was saying, like Chthonian Nightmare, um, Essence Reliquary, Estrid's Invocation is another one that I've had a bunch of fun with. Like all these
Ooh.
random things that that you can really just go deep on, and a lot because the set is so much more complex than usual, because it's a Modern Horizons 3 set. The designers are allowed much higher complexity budget than usual, right? They're just allowed to put more cards. Sorry,
Mhm.
put more words on cards. There's just more places for like synergies to hook on to each other, really, right? Like, an example of this is like for example, the Death Touch, like untap, the spell that's like green mana for get a +1/+1 counter, a Death Touch counter, a Reach counter, and you untap that creature, right? Like
Kiss of the
normally,
Viper,
yeah,
I think. Yeah,
Gift of the
Kiss of the
Viper, yeah.
Viper. Gift of the
Um,
Viper, yeah.
Usually, this would be a 1 mana green combat trick that untaps the creature and gives it a like boost for the turn, right? But because the added like complexity budget, they can put like now you actually get a counter, +1/+1 counter, and a Death Touch counter and a Reach counter, and this now
Mhm.
plays very well with a bunch of like modified synergies where you can like move around the counters with nesting grounds, or you can like have your Death Touch, a permanently Death Touch creature also have trample from like temperamental Oozewag, or just all these random things. Like you could proliferate them, have double Death Touch. That's not that useful unless you also have a nesting grounds, I guess. But like,
But
just
to your point, that matters sometimes, that your thing
yeah,
has double death touch counters, right?
yeah, like it comes up so rarely, but then like there's all these small things that you would have never thought about them until you're sitting there looking at two cards next to each other, and you're like, huh, I guess it does work that way.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? So I think that's a lot of what this format is about, like knowing like knowing how best to use all of these cards, in like often unintuitive ways, knowing how best to go deep on these synergies and like really maximize those, right? Like you can do an okay job just drafting like, oh, okay, I generically have, I'm like in these two colors and I have like good cards in both of these colors. That can do fine. But like if you really want to excel at this format, I think a big part of it is knowing how to go deep on these synergies, how to make sure that like, your red white deck is not just like, a red white aggressive deck, but like works to make the cards that it's playing more than the sum of its parts, right?
Yeah, and this is you described that in great detail, and it's basically something that I said from the get go, and this so very much we're relating what you said about not exactly being in tune with what the general community has been saying about the format, and what your approach to it has been. That was like my mission statement. I think about the format, explaining what a Modern Horizons or like a premium expert plus level set, whatever you want to call it, is like, and what you're looking for. I just really want to co-sign what you said about looking for those, how your cards work together. It's not just like I'm an Eldrazi deck, I'm a red white energy deck. It is, and like I'm sure we're gonna get into, about 2 card interactions, 3 card interactions, looking for how to use all the parts of the buffalo on a card like Gift of the Viper, for example. That, like you said, is if you're looking to master the format, that's what you're looking for.
Yeah. I remember specifically the card Gift of the Viper. I had a really nice deck that had two of those, specifically because I had drafted a copy of Nadu, Nadu Unlimited, guys.
Oh, nice.
And like, Gift of the Viper, fine card, fine combat trick, something that you often see as a one of. But like, I had two copies in my main deck and sometimes considered siding in a third because I just had this reason that I wanted like a one mana way to target my creature sometimes, right?
Mhm.
Like it felt really good whenever I pulled that off, right? Like it felt like I was actually getting quite a lot for, like there isn't this explicit like heroic theme in the set or anything, right? There usually
Right.
isn't a reason to target your own creatures, but this one card just randomly exists, and like, okay, sure, I'll play more of these. Why not?
Yeah, exactly. Or like another example might be when you if you had like a red green deck with two spawn gang commanders or something, right? Like that's another
Yeah.
place where Kiss to the Viper or Gift to the Viper is really good because you give your pinger death touch, and that's obviously a good thing to do.
I have yet to do that, though I really want to at some point.
Yeah, I've done it once. It's pretty sweet. So that's the first thing about the format. Really, mastery comes from a deep understanding of the card pool. I would say. Anything else, broad, general, that you feel about the format?
Um, oh, I think one thing I want to say about the format is I think more so than like honestly any set I've seen before. Though I didn't play very much MH2, and like I suspect this, and I don't remember MH1 that much, but I suspect this is just generally true of Modern Horizon sets. It really feels like every single card is playable. Like it really
Mm,
feels like every single card has some place where it can shine. There are some, okay, there are a few that are like, okay, this is very clearly meant to be, a reprint into modern, like Meltdown, for example, right? Like
yeah.
you're obviously not going to put Meltdown in your main deck, and you barely ever would want to cite it in in limited. But like, other than those kind of like very obvious, like, okay, this is not for us kind of cards, right?
Mhm.
Um, there are just every single card in the set feels like it has a place somewhere, right? Like even if it's just like a mediocre two drop, right? Most of the two drops aren't that mediocre, right? The unicorn in white, right? The bestow unicorn. That's a card that can like vary in power between like being like, okay, this is kind of just a 2 mana 2/2 to being like, oh wow, I can use this in so many ways. I like, the mentor is actually really good because I have so many one power creatures in this deck, or like maybe it being an enchantment is great because I can find it with like my rose cotton knight or something, and just like all these random things that can like make commons that are like otherwise a bit more lackluster shine, right?
Yeah, I do want to get into that a little bit because something that I've been saying about the format and something that has been a sentiment I know a lot of other people have echoed is almost the opposite. It's not. It sounds kind of paradoxical because I think that what I've been saying is there feels like a lack of generically good playables, and it kind of sounds like that fights against what you're saying. But I think, and you can tell me if you disagree or agree with this. I think you're right that all the cards have a place somewhere, but there are a lot of cards that are pretty narrow in their applications. And that could be a pro for some people. People are like, oh, I really like finding that, really making this kind of narrow card tick. But I think for a lot of people, they've expressed some frustration with that, being like, I just want most of my decks to be functional, but sometimes there's so many cards in this packs that only go in one specific deck or a very narrow version of a specific deck. I don't know if you felt that or if you feel a little bit different about that.
Oh yeah, I actually 100% agree with that. And like
Right.
I want to make clear that when I was saying like it feels like every single card in this format is playable, I mean like there aren't really cards that are like zeros everywhere, right? Which
Right.
is like something you might see in like, from MKM, like the really expensive disguise creatures that didn't really do anything, right? Like those were
Mhm.
always mediocre, never really shown out in like any deck, right? Whereas like in this format, like the worst cards in it, other than the like things that are obviously constructed plants, are still like have some home where they really shine, right? And yeah, this also does come with it, like what you were saying of like there are some there are a lot of cards that need a very specific place to really shine, right? So
Yep. I think that the solution to that problem of being like, oh man, I'm short playables is really exercising your knowledge of, or not even exercising the knowledge of the card library, but just really going through the cards and going like, where does this card make sense? You mentioned Estra's Invocation, which by the way is like that weird blue rare enchantment that copies enchantments and you can like pick it up each turn. Like knowing that that's not a stone zero, even though on tier lists or 17 lands that's looks like an F. that is part of what makes this format challenging. And I just wonder if you have any tips because you're somebody whose brain works this way as far as limited goes. How do you bookmark those cards for like, oh, this is a card that has applications. I could use it. It's good to keep that in my back pocket, even though I'm not going to do it every single draft. Like, what's the how do you use that knowledge effectively? I guess.
Yeah, so the big thing I would recommend is just like looking at, especially in a set like this, just looking at every single card like with optimism to some extent,
Hmm.
right? Like looking at every single card and saying like, okay, this doesn't immediately like jump out to me as something that could be powerful, right? This doesn't immediately look like it does anything, right? Astrogenification literally, like, unless you already have an enchantment in play, does nothing, right?
Yeah.
But uh it, I would recommend like digging deeper and say, like at every single card that you might look at and say like, okay, this doesn't look great, right? Look, thinking as hard as you can, like how can, like what could make this look good, right? Like what is the best case scenario for this card, right? How can I make this card work? And the answer for Estra's Invocation is Scurry of Gremlins, which happens to
Ooh.
be an enchantment that is extremely strong, right? You know, obviously if you
Yep.
have a Scurry, you're already doing pretty well for yourself. But that's the 2 red-white enchantment with ETB. Make 2/1/1s and gain energy equal to the number of creatures you have. And it has pay 4 energy to give all of your creatures +1/+0 in haste, right? So like a heroic reinforcements basically. But
Yep.
specifically, if you have both Estra's Invocation and Scurry, and then you play like Scurry into next turn playing Estra's Invocation, or on the same turn, you know, playing Estra's with the Scurry out, then every single turn on your upkeep, you're going to be able to blink the Estra's Invocation, and it'll come back, trigger as a copy of Scurry, and trigger the ETB again. And as it turns out, this will make a quadratic amount of energy as you as you make more and more tokens, right? Like, so the first scurry, like even with no creatures on the board, right? If you play one scurry, you get 2 creatures and 2 energy, right? Then you play the Estrids copying it, you get 2 more creatures and 4 energy. So now you're at 4 and 6, right? And then on your upkeep, you blink it, and you get 2 more creatures and 4 more and 6 more energy. So you're at 6 creatures and 12 energy. And then if you just pay all your energy into that, right, that gives your creatures +3/+0 in haste for a 24 damage already. So it sounds like a value engine, right? Because you're getting something once per upkeep, but actually your opponent dies extremely quickly. So
Yeah, I was gonna say that sounds like dead to me. It's a lot of energy, a lot of creatures. So yeah, that's just one example, but I think that's what that process, like you just said, like look at the cards with optimism. That is another level of drafting that I think is hard to get to because there's so many other levels. It's almost like a pyramid where if you don't have one level, it's hard to get to the next. But once you know generally the good cards, generally the archetypes you want to lean towards, I think you can start making that step to that real next level of understanding how to use the cards. If you feel like you've plateaued in a format, being like, I don't know where else to go to improve, it might be there.
yeah, like that's another thing that I really love about this format, where like if you feel like you've plateaued in this format, right? If it feels like you don't know where to go, you don't know like how to improve, there's just so many different things in this format that you can randomly do, that like if you start looking for like if you actively look for something weird to do, right? Chances are you'll stumble upon something. And that something might not be, you know, the strongest thing, right? Like Estrids plus Scurry is a combo that like I would describe it as Splinter Twin kind of esque, where like if you get if you assemble it, you will win. But like, you know, it's not that easy to assemble it, and like
Right.
Estrids, Scurry is a great card, obviously, but Estrids isn't that great without Scurry. Though there are some other things you can combine it with, like Mustard the Departed. But even still, like that's an example of something that, you know, it's not like it's not going to make your deck like a 10 out of 10 just because it has those 2 cards, right? Like you have to go a bit deeper than that, have more enchantments for Estrids, have things like Rose Caught Knight to find your combo pieces. But like it's still going to like you know, if you end up pulling it off in a draft, it'll feel really good, right? Like wow, this is a like point of power in the format that I didn't even know existed, right? Before I saw it. And there's just so many things like that where like I think this is a very honestly very aspirational set where it's very easy to like look at a card, say like, I bet I can make that work, right? If I really really try, and then like somewhat make it work, and like it might not be the strongest thing, but just gives you another thing to think about, right? Another avenue that you can explore, another choice you can take, another path you can take in the draft if things aren't going your way, right? Like obviously there will be times where just boring red white really open red white aggressive deck like falls into your lap, right? Or you get all the good Eldrazi cards and like 4 Wraithing Chrysalises. Sometimes that happens, right? But for the drafts that are harder, scrappier, and like where you don't see the like obvious strong things, it really benefits to know all of the non-obvious ones, right? Or like have a sense of what they are, or like actively explore for what those are, so that you can use that knowledge in future drafts, right?
No, that's exactly it. And I like that you touched on just like in this exploration, sometimes you could get to do a really cool thing, right? Like it's not always going to be the most fruitful thing as far as like pure win rate up front, but that's the trade-off always of like, well, I'm going to experiment with something, maybe get some reps in that might not be the most winning reps, but I do learn something in the process, and then I can apply those to later drafts, and then you win more long term. I think there's always going to be, it's almost like a muscle building, right? There's always going to be some breaking in your win rate before you build it back up to something stronger. That's how I kind of think of format exploration, and I think that I'm sure you embrace that philosophy a lot too. Although you do win a lot in the process, so.
I remember reading an article at some point. I forget exactly what it was called, but it was like, I remember it was a Magic article that talked a bunch about StarCraft, but specifically there was this really neat graph that was like skill level over time, and like it was like kind of like a roller coaster almost, like generally trending upwards, but like as you learn things and as you apply them, like it's not just a straight like upwards incline of like skill level over time, because like there's some adjustment periods, right? As you like are exploring new things, you often like have to make mistakes first in order to like learn from those mistakes and get better, and like then so that you can make even more mistakes, so then learn from those to get better, and so
Exactly.
on and so forth, right?
Yeah. Let's get a little bit deeper into some MH3 specifics. So, what about, I don't know, generally, did you have any? I think I'm going to ask you the question, did you have any preferences, or did Sanctum have any preferences archetype wise? I know you're generally a drafter who kind of paints outside the lines a little bit and doesn't think archetypes as much, but I'm curious. I'm sure there are some people on the team that did kind of think that way. And even within your own schema of the format, I'm sure you have some preferences. So where were you and the team leaning archetype wise, or just strength of colors wise?
Yeah, I don't think we really leaned in any particular direction in terms of how strong we thought various archetypes were. I think,
Hmm.
I guess there was a bit of like, okay, Eldrazi is a fairly straightforward and strong thing to do, as is like red white aggressive decks with like an energy bent. But like there were just a lot of good options in the format. Like everything could really like hold its own. Oh, I guess one thing that we talked about was like red black really suffered. Like red black as an archetype didn't really come together. Like the artifact stuff, we talked about like probably it takes like multiple copies of the what's it called, cranial ram,
Cranial Ram, yeah.
the equipment uncommon, before you can have a good red black deck, and it's just really hard to make work. But I guess in terms of my own bias, like if we're talking like a like how much I enjoy playing it preference, the answer is definitely Essence Reliquary.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think like that is probably and like both also on a power level to some point to some extent, where like I think that Essence Reliquary is legitimately one of the strongest uncommons in the set, and I would like be very very happy to take it first pick. But like I don't necessarily think that Essence Reliquary decks are the strongest decks in the format so much. Just that it's, you know, it's in the conversation as one of the strong things to be doing.
It gives you a avenue or an axis to work on if you have it early in the draft that's pretty different than drafting
Yeah.
otherwise, right? It's like a true build around in that sense of going, this is going to really alter my pick orders, not just alter my pick orders, but give some new life to cards that maybe are kind of medium or make the better cards even better. Not to jump around conversation too much. Sounds like generally the kind of idea was, yeah, we're not too fussed about archetypes or colors. But I do want to hear a little bit about your take on Essence Reliquary and where you see its applications. Because it's a card I've also gone a little bit deep on the podcast. I've enjoyed it. I've played in a lot of my decks, but I haven't gone super deep. So maybe this is a good conversation just to have of where you're seeing where are the applications of the card. Even though I know they are many, we probably won't get to all of them.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing about Essence Reliquary is that it just gives you infinite late game. Like if you build your deck right, it just lets you outgrind anything really, because there are so
Mm-hmm.
many things that you can get value from. Like it just gives you so much card advantage. And the big thing is that like, okay, so some basic interactions, right? Yeah, obviously anything with an ETB trigger, right? And like for example, a Serum Visionary is like the basic thing that might like first come to mind, right? Oh wow, I can draw a card every turn with this. But actually, I found that like just drawing a card every turn is like on the low end of what you can do with Essence Reliquary. Specifically, like drawing a card every turn is good and all, right? But then you're just playing, you're kind of playing an expensive tome, right? Like
Yeah.
3 mana artifact that's just like taps for 3 mana to like draw a card every turn and scry 2. That's fine and all, but like you can do better. And specifically, I really like having ways to impact the board and make board progress with Essence Reliquary. So things like repeatable removal. There's utter insignificance, the aura that you can like pay to exile. You can put the exile a creature activated ability on the stack and then bounce the utter insignificance in response, which lets
Yeah.
you exile a thing while keeping the other insignificance. Obviously, there's the removal sagas, the Ajani Fells the Godsire and Ralin the Implicit Maze. Both of those are very, very strong with Essence Reliquary. The other sagas are like decent as well, though like just, you know, less strong generically than the red and white sagas at what they do. Um, so yeah, repeatable removal is huge. Also, just like repeatable token making, especially anything that makes 2 tokens. So like Path of
Mm-hmm.
Annihilation, Scurry of Gremlins, of course, are very good. But also, any cheap way to make 1 token is can sometimes be nice for chump blocking. The prime example of this is actually a card that you might not think about when thinking about Essence Scholar card, because it like feels like an aggro card, but Mandibular Kite actually, because
Mm.
you can just play that as a 1 mana 1/1 flyer, chump block with it, and then now you have this equipment laying around. You can just on your like on your turns with Reliquary where you don't want to spend that much mana, right? You don't want to spend an extra 3 mana on your like Serum Visionary or whatever. But you know it's not that hard to find 1 mana laying around. Then you can just pick up your kite and replay it, and suddenly you've just gotten a free 1/1 flyer, right? So there's a bunch of things that you can do with Reliquary. All of them pretty neat, and like just it makes it so easy to just never run out of action.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point that you bring up about wanting something cheap with it, because it is a somewhat clunky card. You have to pay 3 to do kind of nothing. It gets a little takes a little while to get your engines going, and even on the turns where you are a little bit stable, sometimes you're like, well, I want to get value out of this reliquary this turn, but I also want to cast a removal spell or put down this pretty good blocker. And so just having the option, even though if your deck isn't like, oh, I'm going to be looping this infinitely chump blocking with this kite. That's not the thing your deck is doing. But having an option to do that, I think, is pretty important.
Yeah, and that's also why I really like the board affecting like reliquary targets a lot more. And I think they're like extremely important to like having a good reliquary deck, because it's because like you then won't really have to choose between like, oh, I really need to like cast this removal spell and like I need to choose between that and like getting value with my reliquary, because like getting value with your reliquary is casting that removal spell, right?
Right.
Or like
Exactly.
it is like making progress on the board somehow.
Yeah, another pretty good one is a Cursed Marauder, the one in
Yes.
black both people sack something. So you on the stack, if you have an empty board, you pick up the Marauder. They have to sack something. You want to, yeah, it's a little bit tricky to get to the game state where like you have nothing and you're just like looping that. But if you can, yeah, it's just infinite. Every single turn your opponent sacks something, which can be pretty good.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's Essence Reliquary. Anything else? Any other pet cards that you've kind of developed? You tend to have a few per set. I feel so. I don't know.
Well,
Maybe not as deep as Reliquary, but yeah, I'd like to hear if there's anything that's kind of comparable.
well, I already talked about Estrogen. That's a card I've somehow managed to draft 5 times already in this format.
Nice.
I've done like, I don't know, 30-ish drafts. So I think I think in general, like the big thing that the like not really it's like a pseudo archetype that I end up in way more often than I see other people ending up in is like a controlling somewhat base white often build that like controlling multicolor somewhat base white build that specifically makes a lot of use of like artifacts, enchantments, and tokens. And this is exactly what
Mm.
my first PT draft deck was. But like there's just happened to be a lot of like artifacts and enchantments that work with tokens in this set, and like either making tokens or like being able to like grind out things with tokens, or things like Essence Reliquary or like Essence Invocation that let you like reuse ETBs of these like artifacts and enchantments a lot. And then there's also this common that not very many people want, a Rosecott Knight, that is quite strong when you have a lot of strong artifacts and enchantments in your deck, right? A 5 mana 3/4 that just roughly draws a good card. It can be very strong in those kinds of spots.
Hmm.
So yeah, like often these decks are just just playing somewhat of a mid-rangey to controlling game, looking to get value off of interactions with various things like Essence Reliquary, Muster the Departed, Thonian Nightmare is one that often appears in these, Estra's Invocation, just things like that. They're just like a pile of good cards almost, but like with these like small interlocking synergy.
On the topic of Rosecott Knight, yeah, that's been a card I've been playing more and more. It's a card you get very late. Like you don't ever really have to use a pick on it, but I found that the games have slowed down a little bit as the format's gone on compared to the first week. If you've played best of one arena first week, second week, you got really number one, the chrysalises went to the good players because they knew what was up, so games ended pretty quickly. But two, you just don't get the super streamlined decks anymore. I feel where not as often anyways. So the games have slowed down a little bit, and something like Rosecon Knight is a good 5 mana value card. It's just been a card I played a little bit more often. So yeah, just wanna again co-sign that take of Rosecott Knight being a card that I would be on the lookout for. Okay, so you mentioned your PT decks. Why don't we just get into that? Because I think that's probably a good transition period here. So you drafted twice, of course. Like you did make it to day two and did quite well on day two. Let's talk about your day one draft, and I'm gonna be putting this up on the screen for anybody watching on YouTube, and I'll post the links to your Twitter as well. But let's talk about your day one deck here, and this is the black green one, correct? This was the day one. Oh, no, this is the day two one. The,
And
the
then the
day one
Black Green
one
was
is
day two.
the
Yeah.
yeah
Yes.
the day one one's the crazy multicolored one. So
Yeah.
it's 5 colors, if I'm looking correctly. Yeah, it is
Yeah.
actually a 5-color deck.
It
Base
has it has my favorite version of a mana base, which is like just looking at like just I have 9 basics in my deck. It looks like, yeah, 9 basics, 2 plains, one island, 3 swamps, 1 mountain, 2 forests.
Yeah, I was about to say it's base, but there isn't really much of a base. Like it's base black, green-ish. You have a lot of the fetch lands and a few 3 dual lands here. So it is a mana base that is being held together by a lot of fixing. It's not
Yeah.
completely irresponsible. You got a solar transformer in there.
Oh yeah, the mana here was perfect. Well, not perfect. The mana here was only bad whenever I had Thonian Nightmare in my hand and wanted half of my mana to be black. Otherwise, it was
Right.
amazing.
Just some highlights of this deck here. We've got a Path of Annihilation. We've got 2 Wrath of the Skies, which is the white energy field wipe. We've got a Shillingar, the giant demon. We've got Crabomination. We've also got a Brea, Ethereum Shaper, which is the 4-color artifact make 2 Thopters creature, and the Necro Bloom as well, which is the Obzon kind of Field of the Dead creature. Is that a card that you have been playing a decent amount, or do you just feel like it was pretty good in this deck?
So the answer to is that a card I've been playing a decent amount is yes, but only because I'm often in this kind of deck, right?
Right.
It's a card that's specifically good if A, you can cast it, which is like not trivial, and B, you have a lot of ways to trigger it. And specifically, this often means you're like playing kind of 5 colors with a bunch of fetch lands because ideally you want to be able to at least ever make a 2/2, right? And even
Yeah.
then, it's still not like a bomb or anything. It's still only okay, right? But it's just a solid card here. Being a 2/7 was very relevant, just like it blocks, you know?
Right. Totally. Yeah, blocks the chrysalises for quite a while. So I've done this a lot. And I think this deck, it's there's a lot of these small synergies that we were talking about. You've got like victimize in here with like token makers. Anything like stands out to you that applies to what we were talking about, like those like small interactions in this deck that maybe are easy to miss at first glance?
Oh boy, there are so many small interactions in this deck. I could
Oh,
go
I
on
asked
and
a good
on.
question then. Great.
Yeah, so okay. First of all, one of the small negative interactions. This deck is one that has a lot of random artifacts and enchantments that sit around, and it also
Mhm.
has 2 Wrath of the Skies. Obviously, Wrath of the
Right.
Skies is an extremely strong card, especially in a controlling deck like this one, so I was going to play both of them, but it was admittedly slightly awkward with all of my, like, Path of Annihilation, Muster the Departed, Solar Transformer. Okay, I mean, I can't complain too much about Solar Transformer because that is kind of a ritual for the Wrath, but it's still like there were some points where it was slightly awkward, more awkward than I wanted, but overall still very strong, right? Um,
Yep.
so that's the one slop. But so okay, just to list some things off. Muster the Departed plus Path of Annihilation. You can every turn sacrifice a spawn for mana, and then that triggers Morbid on your end step to make another spawn or like another token of your choice. There's Shilgengar with Marionette Apprentice. Oh, there's also a card not in this picture, which is Nadir's Nightblade, which I didn't include initially, but that was a mistake. I definitely should be playing it main deck, and I cited it in every post board game, basically.
That's a card we
Specifically,
should probably read out because like that
oh, sure.
nobody knows what that card is at all. So this is the 2 in a black uncommon 1/3 that whenever a token dies, your opponent loses a life.
Yeah, whenever a token leaves the battlefield, technically.
Leaves the
Uh,
battlefield. Sorry. Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't think
I
there's a
didn't
way
even
to
know it.
exile tokens, really. But yeah, basically the idea is like with either Marionette Apprentice or Nadir's Nightblade, along with Shilgengar, you just get to drain your opponent out of the game pretty easily by like sacking all your other creatures and then sacking all the bloods that you make off of Shilgengar, and that won me several games, definitely. And this
Nice.
deck is also just one that has a lot of random tokens lying around, right? Like
It's
uh,
true.
Path of Annihilation, Muster the Departed, Brea makes a lot of tokens. The Indebted Spirit, like a lot of ways to make random things, which also tie into like a bit of a sack theme with the Shilgengar, along with I have a White of the Reliquary that works with that, and very importantly, a Thonian Nightmare. I was able to do a lot of Thonian Nightmare looping with like Marionette Apprentice and Brea, just like I was able to get a lot of value and won quite a few games with Thonian Nightmare here. Just very strong card when you make it work. I got to get back a Recruiter of the Guard with it once, which was very nice.
That
Um,
is very nice. Yeah, this recruiter looks pretty good in this deck. You have a lot of really good targets to go get, and you can
yeah,
recur it and sack it, and yeah.
yeah. And some other things that work with Thonian Nightmare very well, like just the 3 token makers. Well, okay, one of them's not really a token maker, but Indebted Spirit, Marionette Apprentice, and Obstinate Gargoyle all work very well with Thonian Nightmare because all 3 of them are kind of like 2 bodies in one, which lets you just like grow your board as you're nightmaring instead of just like keeping things constant. So
Mhm.
Brea as well. So I guess I have a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4 that all do that, which is very nice.
Nice.
Another, okay, this is probably the sweetest synergy that happened when playing this deck, which was I had a turn where the previous turn I had played and like a random creature and a Tameo meets the story circle, right? 2 mana blue saga. So going to my turn, it was taking up to 2, so I was able to. I got the mode that was like, discard any number of cards, make twice that many clues, right? So I discard a Brea and a random card, making 4 clues. Then I play Thonian Nightmare. I like had an energy lying around. I think maybe from like Solar Transformer or having played the Nightmare previously, not sure which. So I play the Thonian Nightmare. I don't have red mana in play. I sacrifice a creature in order to get back Brea, which makes 2 Thopters. And I proceed to use my. I think I had 6 mana at this point, so I proceed to use 4 more mana to activate Brea twice, sacrificing the 4 clues I made from Tameo meets the Story Circle to kill 2 of their creatures. This deck was just chock full of these random one-off synergies, just like playing off of each other. Unfortunately, it only went 2-1. I faced off against this deck's nemesis, which is red-green Eldrazi with a lot of trample, and
Mm,
notably very good against a lot of chump blocking tokens.
yep.
But like I don't have that much removal in the deck, unfortunately. Like mostly just this like amphibian downpour and the wraths, and I didn't draw the wraths that much in that match. And yeah, like this was a deck that I would have expected to go somewhere between 2-1 and 3-0. Landed on the 2-1 side. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, and this is, I think, a good. Before we get to the second deck, I think it's good to just touch on getting into a 5-color deck in this format or a 4-color deck, because it's actually been something that I have not done very much, and I've even on the podcast advocated kind of leaning away from, just because the landscapes, while they do help you get whatever color of mana, they lock you in, so they're not as good as just say like a dual land or a tri land. Not to say they're not good, but I have found myself leaning away from multicolor decks when usually at this point in the format I lean towards them. And maybe this is a push for me to, wake up and try to do this a little more often. But what's your take on the lands, on the common lands in the format? Last episode, or one of the last episodes that I talked about the lands, you made a comment in the Limited Level Ups Discord saying like, "Oh, actually, I disagree with the take of not playing multicolor stuff, or at least the lands being less good than they would be in some other set." So yeah, I'd just like to hear any thoughts around that.
The way I would put it is, okay. First of all, in terms of how high I am on the lands, to give it a sense of that, I think I am taking these lands generally higher than I took Deserton OTJ, which is
Wow.
high
Okay.
praise.
Yeah.
Only a bit higher, but like basically because there are so many cards that like like we said before, right? There are so many cards that don't fit everywhere, right? So many cards that really need a specific home to work. There will sometimes be packs where like you don't really see anything that like slots perfectly into your deck. Maybe some okay cards that are not going to be that well maximized in your deck. But also there might be some lands, right? And
Mhm.
my philosophy generally is to mostly take the land in that case, right? First of all, like the MDFCs are all great, like all the like 2-color MDFCs, just great fixing, like and also just very powerful effects often. Just having this MDFC. So those are like a separate thing of like, okay, those are just individually strong cards. But the reason why I like taking the landscape so much is because to me it's like a sense of like opening doors down the line, right? Because there are so many specific cards and because there are so many random synergies, a lot of these synergies are not just like in 2 colors, right? Like
Mhm.
all of these synergies that I listed out in this deck, right? A lot of them are across wildly distinct colors, right?
Right.
Not it's not none of them are like fitting in this like neat 2-color box, right? Like there's a bunch of the deck is base white black because a lot of the cards that do things here are like white and black. Like a bunch of the token makers are black white, along with the Thonian Nightmare being black. But then there's these random things like Brea having various synergies, or like this White of the Reliquary in green. So there's a lot of reasons to branch out into like random colors beyond just 2 in order to find more power, find more synergy, right? So I think it's often very valuable to be able to do that, right? To be able to take the card that you want when you see it, even if it's not like in the colors that you were already planning. Um, And this doesn't always apply, right? Sometimes you're in a straight two-color deck that is just doing a very straightforward thing. Your lane is open, or like open enough that you're like, okay, I'm just drafting this red-white aggressive deck. Or as we're going to see in my day two draft, I'm just drafting the straight black-green deck
Mhm.
with like a bunch of modified synergies. Like I don't need stuff outside of this. But like
Yeah.
a lot of the times, so a lot of the times when you're in the like main synergies, right? Like okay, you're thinking like, okay, blue black card draw, Temur Eldrazi, Jeskai energy. Those are the points where you often have like, okay, uh, there's enough support in just two colors that like I can probably make this work without much fixing, right? Even still, those some of those archetypes like Eldrazi and energy are built in three colors, so you'll often have incentive to at least splash. But like the main places where you really want to get into like more multicolor piles are when you're doing something a bit stranger, right? Like this deck. A bit going a bit deeper into like these like not as explicit synergies, right? Like I mentioned earlier in the episode, Estrid's Invocation plus Scurry of Gremlins. That's a very naturally a three-color combo, right? You need red, white, and blue for that. So
Right.
there's plenty of things that are combos in the set that are like that. For example, one I've seen is Metastatic Evangel plus Evolution Witness, which is a two-card combo, admittedly, right? That letting whenever a non-token creature enters, proliferating, which then gets something back from your graveyard. But the third color to add to that I've seen do a lot of work is Accursed Marauder, because that specifically is a non-token creature that then immediately puts itself into the graveyard. So like I've had someone just like
Mm.
basically machine gun down my board, replaying this Marauder over and over again for every single 2 mana, and just making it so I can never have a creature on the board. So
Right, because just to spell that out, basically, like the Marauder comes in, proliferates the Evolution Witness. The Evolution Witness triggers, you get something back, and you just keep doing it and making them sack something for 2 mana. That is real nice. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
that's exactly the stuff we're talking about here.
Yeah, so there's like a bunch of things like that like like because there are so many synergies in the set, it's very often the case that you can get access to like quite a lot more power if your mana is good enough, right? So that's why I really like prioritizing the lands when I don't have like something all that powerful to take, right? If it's just like a mediocre like filler playable, I am definitely taking a land over it. And often if I already have a reason to like want to splash, I am highly prioritizing the lands, right? Because I really
Hmm.
want to have good mana in order to take advantage of all these synergies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that my some of my apprehension has been like almost a little bit not going far enough in the direction you're talking about, because I think the times that I've splashed and been unhappy about it have been like splashing a card or two that is like a generically powerful card or two. And while that is fine to do, I think I've come to the conclusion that most of the time making your mana a little bit worse, or maybe even like a notch worse for a little bit of bump and power, using these lands specifically because they can be a little bit awkward, is not an equation that results in winning that much more. I think if you want to take a hit to your mana base, you have to be doing it for reasons that like more of what you're saying, like you're going way over the top, really doing some engine-y things, not just like, yeah, this card's a little bit better than the 23rd card you could have instead.
Yeah, yeah. Like very rarely in the set am I finding myself splashing removal. For example, like
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
almost never just like straight up. Oh, I really want to play this Galvanic Discharge. I guess I'll play like a mountain and a couple duels, right? Like that's
Hmm.
not generally how I'm splashing. And in fact, these lands are very suited to 5-color decks instead of like and less suited to like they really want you to be playing four or 5 colors and less so like two with a splash, right? Because they very naturally touch 3 colors, right? This is these lands are like, okay, if you're playing, let's say, I don't know, Jeskai, right? Blue white splashing red, right? You might want to see like the Mardu land, and you're like, great, I can take this, but this is just a dual land in my deck. But like if you get
Hmm.
like two Mardu lands, two like Grixis lands, and two Esper lands, right? Suddenly you just have 6 free black sources. So why not splash black, right?
Right.
And like this often happens where it's like, okay, I actually randomly have like since I've been taking these lands to like have better mana, I might just randomly have lots of colors that I wasn't even intending on playing, and then that just opens me up to take any card that I see in the draft, right?
And to dial it in a little bit, let's take a look at your day 2 draft, which is well, not exactly 2 colors, but it's very, very close to a 2-color deck. It's a black-green deck with a light splash, of white, and it looks pretty normal. Like, it's just got a lot of good comments. It's got, like, 2 Eldrazi Repurpose. Are you sure this is your deck? Are you sure you didn't just make sure it was good?
Okay, so the interesting part of this deck is definitely the draft. So in terms of the splash, yeah, this is very much like mostly a straight 2-color deck with 1 copy of Metastatic Evangel and 1 copy. Okay, I think it's very it's very glary, but there's 1 copy of Undo Not Master in there. So just like a couple like modified, like high power modified stuff on the splash. And
Mhm.
or well, okay, it's not master isn't that powerful, but like did do some work at various points. Like a couple of those cards like fill out the deck. There was even a game where I decided like post board I would be better off just cutting the splash in that matchup and just registered or like presented a straight black green deck in game 2 and 3.
Right.
But yeah, so mostly a straightforward black green deck. How I ended up in this deck though is interesting because basically what happened was I just wasn't seeing much power in like much in the way of powerful cards in my early picks, right? I think my pack one pick one was Nightshade Dryad. To give you a sense of like how powerful the pack was, like obviously Nightshade Dryad is a fantastic card, but like
Mhm.
there certainly was no like Essence Reliquary or Scurry of Gremlins there wasn't anything like strong to build around in my first pick, and like there wasn't anything in like my second, third, or fourth pick either, right? Like I at like around the start of pack one, I was mostly just taking good green commons like Nightshade Dryad, Basking Root Walla, Eldrazi Repurposer, right? Just not a lot of power there. But one thing I was noting throughout the start of pack one was that I believe pack one pick 1 or 2, I saw a Lion Umbra in the pack, right? And Lion Umbra is a very strong but very narrow card where like if you can cast it, right, specifically, well, okay, both the green and also having a modified creature, it can really take over games and be really hard for some decks to deal with, right? But it's also not a card that I really love taking like that early because I don't, it is a card that is very restrictive in where it can be played. So as I was taking these green commons, I was thinking about that Lion Umbra from like early pack one, and then I also started seeing all of these copies of Fangs of Colonia, which also falls into the same boat of like, okay, this card can be a strong card if you are specifically like modified aggressive deck. Um,
Mhm.
uh, especially if you have Watchdogs, though unfortunately I didn't see any of this draft. Um, but I saw 3 of them go by in pack one. So I was
Right.
so throughout all of this, I was thinking like, huh, okay, I bet I'm gonna get all 4 of those cards on the wheel, and I think that's probably just gonna be my game plan. So that's why I
Right. Yeah,
just
yeah.
kept taking these like decent decent green commons with like not anything too exciting, but specifically setting up a bit to go into like a modified space where like I was taking Basking root scale higher than I would normally. Because I was like, okay, I might wheel these cards. And brute scale is also very nice with Fangs, right? Because it goes wide a bit, which,
Mhm.
nice for the overload and also ramps to it. But yeah, so I had that thought throughout the start of pack one, and then I was right. The Lion Umbra wheeled, and then all 3 of the Fangs came around as well. So I
Nice.
was like, at the end of pack one, I was like, okay, I have a bunch of green commons, a Lion Umbra, and 3 Fangs, and like from there, I just went from there, right? The main disappointment of this draft was like this deck definitely had holes in it. Specifically, it's had very few ways to give its creatures evasion. I think the only way in the deck is experimental Oozwag. Sorry, not experimental, temperamental Oozwag. One copy of Oozwag, right? Unfortunately, the Magic Online bug did not happen, which put the Oozwag in every pack. I would have loved that. But I
That was a
really like.
really funny bug, by the way. If anybody hasn't seen that, there's people posting their MTGO deck that just like had like 17 Oozwags in them just because like somebody was like, look how absurd this bug is. Yeah, really funny.
Yeah, but I could have used 17 more Oozwags. Maybe not 17, maybe like 3 more. But like, the point stands. Like, I lost a match. I went 2-1 with this deck, and the last match I lost was very much because I did not have ways of like pushing through Eldrazi spawns, right? Like,
Mhm.
I like was able to force several chump blocks a turn, but unfortunately that wasn't quite enough in 2 of the games. So that's how I lost that match. And I do think there was a mistake in the draft where I passed up on like an early pack 2 dread mask, colossal dread mask. Because I was
Mhm.
like, okay, I'm sure I'll see some Oozwags this draft. I don't need this worst trample source, right? In the end, I really wished I had it, but
Right.
but yeah. So this was very much an interesting draft to me, just because of like how it panned out. Where I didn't like specifically on the wheel, like getting specifically all of those things on the wheel and like crafting my game plan there definitely felt very nice.
Yeah, and it looks like this is actually a pretty good example too of I said it looks like a pretty normal draft. Like there's nothing too special about it. And black green isn't one of like the top winning archetypes or anything, but you're still using that mindset of like I really want to make sure my cards interact well together. Like talking about the Lion Umbra, talking about wheeling Fangs of Colonia, which is something you can pretty reasonably do draft in, draft out, taking cards that play well with those cards a bit higher. That is part of the draft navigation in this format, to have a deck that is better than the sum of its parts. And this deck went 2-1, and it's nothing like there's no awesome rares really. There's nothing too special, and it was just a good deck that played well together. Well, had its cards play well together, right?
Yeah. I think in
Yeah.
fact, are there any rares in this deck? There's a Nadu in the sideboard.
Yeah, not doing the
But
sideboard. I
I think
think it's
there's
rareless
none.
though.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
this is a completely rare free deck. I just like didn't
Nice.
see anything that like appealed. And like on the point of like synergistic things, right? Well, it's like the 2 Eldrazi Purposers and the Hunger Tide Rises. Those were cards I very specifically wanted to pick up because I had 3 things, right? And like wanted ways to A, ramp into it with the Purposers, and B, like go wide a bit to have like I had a game where I played 1 Hunger Tide Rises, which made me 3 insects, and then cast Fangs of Colonia 3 turns in a row to grow 3 very, very large insects.
Nice. Yeah, those sound like very, very burly insects that I'm sure killed your opponent very quickly.
Well, okay, I didn't actually end up getting there because my opponent ended up getting to cast Emrakul.
Oh well, those insects are there now. Theirs that right their rightful property. Unfortunately, by the will of Emrakul.
Those insects killed someone, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Let's just we're kind of coming up to the end of the podcast here, but we don't have to go super deep. But any thoughts on the deck you played? You played a version of Nadu. But how what was that like? I mean, obviously your deck was a strong deck. It wouldn't be you wouldn't be able to do as well as you did otherwise, and Nadu was a broken card. But any interesting tidbits from playing or coming up with the deck list?
Yeah, so the version of Nadu Sanctum brought was actually one of the, I think, more interesting versions of Nadu at the tournament. I think we innovated quite a bit, though, like, in small ways. The biggest thing is definitely the card Malevolent Rumble, which is basically Ponder, because it only costs
Yep.
1 mana net and looks at 4 cards, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know how good that card is in Limited. It turns out that card's also very good and constructed in the right home. So
Right.
I think that was one of the big things that we brought, that was that gave us an edge to some extent. Less so in the mirror, unfortunately, because there was a lot of the mirror being played at the tournament, and like it wasn't as advantageous in the mirror, but like gives the deck more resiliency basically. Overall, like mostly, it was PT Nadu. Like Nadu was
Yep.
broken. Half of our team registered Nadu and did very well with it. We got so I top aided, and then all of Nicole, Etienne, and Nate locked up their Worlds qualifications, which is very exciting. We'll have
Nice.
Sanctum will have a very large team going into Worlds. Well, yeah, 7 people, but it's still fairly large. So that's very nice. And yeah, it feels good to do well at another PT. Apparently, I just keep continuing to do better at constructed than limited for some reason. So yeah.
Well, that's the format that's being rewarded right now. So can't complain, I guess, right? It lets you
Yeah.
play more limited, being good at constructed. Well, as always, Jason, thank you so much for sharing with us. I hope you continue to top eight or at least do very well. Not that I wouldn't have you back on the podcast otherwise, but it just gives us a good excuse to have you on the podcast. So thanks so much. Do you have any shout outs, any call outs you want before we pack up?
I mean, shout out again to my team, Sanctum. Always a pleasure testing with Sanctum. Always a pleasure, like figuring out how to break formats from limited to constructed.
Anywhere people can reach you if they want to do so or find anything that you put out?
Yeah, you can find me basically anywhere at JasonILTG, either on Twitter or Discord or wherever. Twitch as well. You can find articles that I write at experimentalsynthesizer.blog. And all of them are free eventually, though. Like the past month of them are paywalled behind Patreon. Highly recommend at least checking out my free articles. I think I write good ones.
I think so too. Yeah, I will vouch for that. I'll put that in the description, of course, for anybody who wants to find those things. And I think that'll do. Jason, that's once again awesome time just hanging out with you and talking. Everybody out there, thank you so much for watching and listening. We'll see you next time.
Bye.